Throughout history, philosophers have been asking questions like, what's knowledge? What's time? What's virtue? Fundamentally, these are conceptual questions. We're asking about the concepts of knowledge, time, and virtue. For a long time, people thought that these kinds of conceptual questions were asking about the essences of things in the world. So, for example, when we ask, what is time? It seems that we want to know something about the fundamental nature of reality. Just over 100 years ago, some philosophers started to look at these questions in another way. They argued that when we ask these conceptual questions, we're really just asking about the words in our language. This means that to answer these questions, we don't need to construct elaborate theories about the nature of reality. Instead, we need a better understanding of our language and how it works. Gilbert Ryle was one of the philosophers who took this view. He saw philosophy as a kind of conceptual map-making. We'll take a look at his conception of philosophy in this video. Ryle starts his discussion by noting how difficult it can be to answer these conceptual questions. This is true even when the concept is familiar to us. For example, we talk about people knowing things all the time, and yet it's very hard to give a definition of knowledge. To help us understand why this is, Ryle distinguishes between talking with concepts and talking about concepts. We talk with a concept when we use it to talk about something else. So, for example, someone might say, it's probably going to rain tomorrow. Here they're talking with the concept of probability, but they're talking about tomorrow's weather. On the other hand, we talk about a concept when we say something about the concept itself. So, for example, a philosopher might say, knowledge is justified true belief. Here, we're not just using the concept of knowledge to talk about something else. We're actually talking about the concept of knowledge itself. Ryle thinks that it's talking about concepts that we find difficult, even when we find it easy to talk with them. What's the relationship between talking with and talking about concepts? Well, first, talking about a concept is, in some sense, more sophisticated than talking with them. Ryle thinks that you have to be able to talk with a concept before you can talk about it. Second, talking about a concept is parasitic upon talking with it. When we talk about a concept, we're saying something about what we do when we talk with it. Ryle gives an analogy to explain this. Think of a sculptor using a chisel in his work, and then think of a mechanic who helps to maintain and repair the sculptor's chisel. The sculptor uses his chisel to work on something else, so he's like someone talking with a concept. The mechanic works on the chisel itself, so he's like someone talking about a concept. Ryle notes that, fundamentally, the mechanic's work is dependent on the sculptor's work. He works on the chisel as a tool for the sculptor, so that the sculptor can use it effectively. Ryle thinks that philosophers have a similar role. They talk about concepts to help us talk with them and to avoid conceptual confusions. We still need to work out why it's so difficult to talk about concepts, even when it's easy to talk with them. Ryle develops another analogy to help explain this. Imagine someone who's lived in the same town all their life. They know how to get from any place in the town to any other. Yet, if someone asked them to make a map of their town, they wouldn't be able to do it. While it's easy for them to navigate around their town, they find it difficult to explain what they're doing when they do this. Ryle suggests that we're like this with our language. The philosopher is like a map maker who maps out the logical geography of our concepts. But what does he mean by this? I think we can understand him by thinking about what it means to understand a concept. It seems that using a concept involves following certain rules. These rules determine which sentences containing the concept are allowed and which aren't. So, for example, think about the sentence, Monday is taller than Tuesday. We know that this doesn't make any sense. This is because it breaks the rules that determine our use of the concept of being tall. These rules also determine what sentences follow logically from the sentences which contain the concept. So, for example, if we know that Bob is taller than Alice, and Alice is taller than Jane, we can infer that Bob is taller than Jane. This is because we understand the rules governing the concept of being tall. Ryle notes that we may be able to follow these rules without being able to outline them explicitly. In other words, we can talk with them easily, but struggle to talk about them. This is how we can understand Ryle's claim that philosophy is like cartography. The person in the town can follow certain navigational rules, though they can't give a general account of what these rules are. We're in a similar position. We can follow the logical rules that determine how we use our concepts, but we can't explain what those rules are. Philosophers, then, are like map makers because they try to map out the general rules that govern our use of concepts. Importantly, a map can't describe a single landmark. So, philosophers shouldn't try to understand concepts one at a time. Instead, they should outline the logical relations that hold between our concepts. Ryle's central work, The Concept of Mind, does exactly this. It tries to map out the relations between various concepts that we use when we talk about the mind. If, as Ryle claims, we can follow the logical rules of our language well enough, why do we need philosophers? It looks like all they do is to tell us explicitly what we already know implicitly. Ryle's answer is that philosophy helps us to avoid conceptual confusions. Sometimes we might start talking more abstractly than usual. We might start asking some more fundamental questions about minds, for example. These still might be factual questions as opposed to conceptual questions. Even so, here we'll be using our concepts in an unfamiliar setting. This, Ryle thinks, can lead us into conceptual confusions. Ryle discusses the concepts of sensation and observation. He looks in particular at the classical empiricist account of sensations. For thinkers like Locke and Hume, sensation involves observing a kind of object, an impression or sense datum. Sense data are supposed to be atomic units of sensation. Classical empiricism builds its entire theory of mind and knowledge on this idea. Ryle, however, thinks that this approach makes a fundamental mistake. It confuses the logic of observation with the logic of sensation. Observation always has an object. If we know that someone is making an observation, we can infer that there's something that they're observing. Ryle doesn't think that sensation works in the same way. Having a sensation doesn't seem to entail that there's something that you're sensing. Classical empiricism seems to be confusing observing with sensing. They think that sensation must have an object. They invent the concept of sense data to give an account of what that object must be. By simply showing that, in our language, having a sensation doesn't entail sensing some kind of object puts classical empiricism into doubt. Importantly, this conceptual confusion is not just a philosopher's problem. It's also influenced psychology and other sciences. Ryle thinks that, by pointing out this confusion, philosophers can help put the scientific study of the mind on the right track. Ryle sums up his view of philosophy when he says, "Philosophy is the replacement of category habits by category disciplines." Whereas before, our use of concepts was a mindless habit, which might lead us into mistakes and confusions, philosophy can help us to turn our use of concepts into a careful discipline.